Hi, this is Mrs. Belknap. This is my very first screencast, so you have to bear with me here. But I'm bringing to you today the story of the Civil Rights Movement, which for us is Standard 14, A and B. So here goes nothing. So we start with the emergence of the movement in the 1950s. After World War II, civil rights leaders decided that they wanted to focus the fight for civil rights on desegregating schools. So you remember the NAACP, which was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1910, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was one of the primary civil rights organizations in the 20th century. After World War II, its lead attorney, whose name was Thurgood Marshall, pictured there, he was a graduate of Howard University and the University of Maryland Law School, put together a team of lawyers to help fight school segregation. One of the individuals on his team was a Virginia lawyer known as Oliver Hill. So you need to remember that name. He was a very well-respected Richmond lawyer, and he brought to the case a plaintiff from Prince Edward County, which is in Virginia, where Longwood University is located. The case itself becomes known as Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, and it was heard by the Supreme Court in 1954. The case included 5 plaintiffs, including Linda Brown. So it's forever known as the Brown decision because her name came first alphabetically. But it's important to know also that there were 5 plaintiffs total. So 1 from Virginia, 1 from Washington, D.C., 1 from Delaware, and 1 from South Carolina. Ultimately, Marshall's team presented a very effective argument that segregation was psychologically damaging to African American children. And they used an experiment in which they had children come into a room and they had 2 baby dolls. One was black and one was white. And almost every child, black and white, chose the white doll to play with. And when asked why they chose the white doll, they answered honestly, as children always do, and they said the white doll was better. So that experiment alone, was enough to convince the court that segregation was detrimental to the psychological well-being of African American children, and they said that schools must desegregate with all deliberate speed, that separate is not equal, as the court had said in Plessy versus Ferguson, and therefore school segregation had to take place. Now, this did not happen without some resistance by whites. So in Virginia, for example, massive resistance took the form of literally closing down the schools. So in Prince Edward County, which is where one of the plaintiffs was from, rather than integrate the schools, they just closed the schools for a period of 5 years. So if you were wealthy, then you could go to private school. If you were not wealthy and you did not have transportation, you just did not go to school for 5 years. Then another phenomenon that happens, especially in cities like D.C., Charleston in South Carolina, Richmond, and other urban areas, is that as the suburbs grew up after World War II, whites moved out to the suburbs, and that left African Americans in the inner city. This phenomenon was called white flight, and that created a situation where you had de facto segregation, which is segregation by fact instead of segregation by law. So that then would create some problems in integrating when people are living very separately from each other. You also saw in the 1950s the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and then something else known as the White Citizens Councils, and these were mostly, the White Citizens Councils were mostly in the suburbs, and they were like homeowners associations that would pass bylaws stating that African Americans could not move into their neighborhoods. So white resistance was very real in this time. We look at, as an example of that, a city called Little Rock in Arkansas, and in 1957, Little Rock became one of the first cities to integrate its school system, and they met with a lot of resistance. Now you're going to watch some video clips in class that really bring this to life, but I wanted to show you this picture. Here in this picture, you have one of the Little Rock 9, the 9 students who were chosen to integrate Little Rock High School. Her name is Elizabeth Eckford. You see her pictured here. All right, and then this girl behind her. I want you to take a really close look at her face and pay attention to her facial expression, her body language, and that kind of thing. All right. She was taunting Elizabeth on that first day of school, and later, much later, she did apologize to Elizabeth for the treatment that she gave her on that first day of school. And there's a really good book about how their relationship developed in the years after the Civil Rights Movement, and I put the cover of it here. It's Elizabeth and Hazel, Two Women of Little Rock, and it's a really fascinating story about how they moved past hard feelings over integration and the impact of that year facing all that white resistance had on Elizabeth. So it's worth checking out. At the same time that that's going on, we have probably one of the most significant events in the civil rights movement of the 1950s, and that was the Montgomery bus boycott. That was when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger, December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, and the community there decided that they would boycott the buses and try to get the bus company to integrate because they'd be losing money from the boycott. And the boycott was led by Martin Luther King Jr. He was a young minister living in Montgomery at the time. He was 26 years old, and this is where he really started to formulate his ideas about nonviolent resistance. So he helped to organize the boycott, and he formed a new civil rights group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. And with the SCLC worked with the NAACP in order to get their agenda, which was integration of all parts of society, put into practice. He advocated the theory of nonviolent resistance. So no matter what, the goal was that if violence was done to you, you are nonviolent. And that the only violence the cameras would see, that is television cameras, would be the whites against African Americans. You're going to see a lot of that in the videos that we'll watch in class. So ultimately, his ideas are based on Christianity and the teachings of Jesus Christ, as well as the writings of Henry David Thoreau in his essay on civil disobedience, which really outlines the idea that an unjust law should not be followed. Okay. Then in 1960, there's another wave of protests that involves public facilities like restaurants, and this was known as the sit-in movement. So on February 1st, 1960, a group of students, both white and African American, trained to go and sit in at the all-white lunch counters in Greensboro, North Carolina. So the first one was at a Woolworths department store, and a Woolworths was just like a CVS or a Walgreens, but it had a little restaurant in it. So the restaurants were whites only. If you were African American and you wanted to get food, you had to go around to the back to be served. The students who led this sit-in movement formed an organization called SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they went through a lot of training to learn how to resist nonviolently. By August of 1961, over 70,000 students had participated in the sit-in movement. And again, we'll watch some really dramatic scenes from this movement in class. Next, we have the Freedom Rides. And the Freedom Rides took place in the summer of 1961. Again, college students will form the basis of this movement, and they organized bus rides from DC to New Orleans. You can see on the map here the different routes that they took, and their goal was to integrate the bus stations. So going from Washington, D.C. to Raleigh, to Wilmington, to Charleston, Savannah, Jacksonville, Ocala, Tampa. And you can see along the way that people were arrested. Just like the sit-in movement, that is a goal. You're going to put pressure on the system by having people arrested. Then, as they got into the Deep South, in Alabama in particular, they were met with resistance and their bus was firebombed. This is the after picture of them sitting outside the bus. Nobody was killed, unbelievably, nobody was killed in the Freedom Rides. And President Kennedy sent armed troops to Mississippi to protect them the rest of the way. Then in 1963, there's a very dramatic demonstration that takes place in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's a conflict between the established white government and a new moderate government that was elected into office. Whereas the old conservative government really felt strongly about segregation, the new more moderate government felt like they could move towards integration. But the old government would not leave office, and the new government started meeting as well, and so there was a lot of confusion. This led to Martin Luther King and his group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, focusing in on Birmingham. They called this event Project C, like they were going to concentrate all their efforts on the integration of Birmingham. So in 1963, they started their mass demonstrations. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested, and it's there that he wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail, which I know a lot of you read in English this year. When things started to sort of fade back and they couldn't get as many adults to participate in the demonstrations, they asked the adults if their children could participate, and so they started what was called the Children's March. And on the first day of the Children's March, 600 people were arrested, and then on the second day is when you saw this scene, which is when the chief of police, his name was Bull Connor, brought out the dogs and the fire hoses to try and break up the demonstrations. And we'll watch some of that in class as well. Later that year, in September of 1963, the site of the organization of this demonstration, the 16th Street Baptist Church, was bombed, and 4 girls who were in the basement practicing for the choir were killed. And so that becomes sort of a memorial to the Civil Rights Movement. And then the last thing that I want to talk to you about in this screencast is the March on Washington, probably the most famous event of this 1963 Civil Rights Movement, or the modern Civil Rights Movement is what I'm trying to say. So in 1963, the March on Washington occurred, and this was something that had been in the planning stages since World War II. So there was a man named A. Philip Randolph, and he came up with this idea of marching on Washington for jobs and freedom while World War II was going on. And FDR made a deal with him. He said that FDR said he would integrate the defense industry if Randolph agreed not to hold the demonstrations. So finally, in 1963, this idea is revived, and they get the word out across the country that there's going to be a very large, peaceful demonstration in the Capitol, and so people from all walks of life showed up for the demonstration. Martin Luther King had the keynote address, and that is where he gave his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And you can see the crowd there stretched out in front of him, and he's just sort of reveling in this, like, wow, you know, this is amazing that all these people have come today. This march, along with the events in Birmingham, helped to influence public opinion to support civil rights legislation, and it really demonstrated the power of nonviolent mass resistance. Then, the following year, 1964, we would have the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and hopefully you recognize this man here, and again pictured here. All right, this is Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson was really instrumental in getting this law passed by Congress. The law stated that discrimination was prohibited, and this is all discrimination, whether it's based on race, religion, national origin, or gender. So this is the first time that women will be included in any civil rights legislation, and it would permanently desegregate public accommodations in the country. 1964, we have the Freedom Summer, where federal registrars were sent to the South to register voters. There was a demonstration in which Martin Luther King led a march from Selma to Montgomery. And ultimately that would lead to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed the literacy tests.